Hello, everyone, and welcome to my session today. I really appreciate you taking time out from a very, very stiff competition to attend my session about Open Source Licensing 101 with a little bit of a preview of intellectual property out there. As mentioned earlier, if you do have questions, feel free to go and add them to the Q&A panel, and I'll try to address them both during the presentation as well as after. I'll set a little bit of time towards the very, very end about that. Now, a little bit about me. As mentioned earlier, I am with the Open Source Program Office in Salesforce, but I'm also a very active developer. I most probably have been actively coding for nigh on 40 years or so, and still consider myself a developer at heart. I've been developing and coding and programming open source since before it was even called open source. But of course, I've also handled a lot of other hats. I've worn hats as far as, again, being part of open source program offices in various organizations, served on board of directors for a number of open source foundations. And if I am familiar to you, if the name does ring a bell in any way, shape, or form, it's most probably due to my involvement with the Apache Software Foundation, which I helped co-found and served on the board for many, many years. But the one thing you really need to know about me, especially in regard to this session right here, is
promise number one, I am not a lawyer.
That's right. I am not a lawyer. So even though we will be talking about some legally kind of focused things, this isn't legal advice. It can't be legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. I can't practice without a license. But this is some information that I've gleaned over my very, very long tenure in open source and dealing with open source governance models, open source licenses, and how it intersects both the developer ecosystem as well as the business ecosystem itself. So a little bit of a review about what intellectual property is. Basically, these are the assets that business, corporation, and entity will own. You know, these are the tangible things. These are the things that actually have value to a company or organization, or in this case, open source projects, because open source projects, open source foundations do have intellectual property. And when you're leveraging open source, when you're using it, contributing to it, of course, you're engaging with intellectual property at some base level. One form of intellectual property are trade secrets. Most probably the canonical example of that is the secret formula to Coke. This is a way of protecting some intellectual property that your company or organization have that prevents other people from using it. For the sake of this discussion, we won't be talking about trade secrets per se. Might touch on it a little bit when we start talking about patents. But just consider the trade secrets are something that doesn't, is there, does exist. But in general, open source really doesn't get involved with that. Open source licenses don't get involved with it. It's not something that we really touch on in many, many cases inside of open source communities and with projects. The second asset, which is considered an intellectual property, are trademarks, and these are service marks. Basically, think of a brand, the brand of something. And for some open source organizations, this is most probably the most valuable asset for them, because after all, as we'll talk about a little bit later on, licenses, the actual source code that you are creating in an open source project, you're giving it away. And so that really doesn't have, quote, much value. It's not really an asset per se in the way that it has, a value associated with that you can bank on, a monetary value, so to speak. But trademarks are different. And you see in a lot of cases, open source projects are very protective of their trademarks, as they should be. because the name, the branding of an open source project is very, very important. It is their tangible asset. You'll also notice as we talk about licenses that none of the licenses actually give you access to use the trademark. So in most cases, when you want to leverage or use an open source name or the name of a project or the name of a foundation that releases an open source project, what you need to worry about is the concept of fair use and how you can use these brands in a way that aren't infringing on their actual trademark. And there are actually other open source projects and ecosystems which allow you to license their trademark, considering, for various reasons. And some of that could just be you agree to use it in a nice, correct, communal, responsible way. Some open source projects may say we want, some kind of, fee associated with your reuse. It really depends on the organizations and things of that nature. But again, the main takeaway for this particular thing is that open source projects do protect their trademarks. And just because you may be using or consuming the open source project doesn't necessarily mean that you have that kind of full unrestricted access and use to the trademarks. The third form of intellectual property are patents. And in particular, in this particular case, as far as open source is concerned, the biggest we'll be talking about is the idea of software patents. And there is still a healthy debate on whether or not software patents are good or evil, whether they should exist or whether they shouldn't exist. After all, there is a train of thought that anything which can and should be patented as far as a software patent might really be better suited as being under full copyright, in which case you don't have it, or even as a trade secret, and so the idea that patents and software are a natural fit is still under healthy debate. I won't go into a lot associated with that, except when we start talking about how open source licenses touch upon the idea of patents and whether or not patents are included in the restrictions, but in the freedom that you're associated with and given in the open source licenses per se. And then finally, the fourth form of intellectual property, and the one that we are really going to be focused about, because this is where open source licensing is really designed to interface with. It's the whole idea of copyrights is the real reason that open source licenses exist. Now, unlike most of the other forms of intellectual property at some level or another, copyrights kind of like spring into existence at the moment of their creation. You do not have to declare something under copyright. Once you create it, once there is a creative work that you have created, basically, it is already under copyright. You already have ownership and control over how you want that created work to be used. So remember that when you start looking at various places to use and leverage code. For example, if something is under GitHub, but it doesn't have a license associated with it, if you're looking in the repo and there isn't a license.txt or MD file, and you're not seeing a license header in any of the files, consider that as being under full copyright, which really restricts what you can and cannot do with it. So the whole idea about free software and open source was all about how do I make sure that I'm creating something and not avoiding copyright, because there are some aspects of copyright we want to maintain, but how do I open things up such that other people can share them in accordance with some of the goals and ideals that I have regarding this software sharing, this sharing of code inside there. And that is really what licensing is about. So licensing is about creating a document that redefines copyright between the person who's creating the code and the audience, the users, the consumers and users of that code, and how they can go about using it, what controls and restrictions are in place inside there. Now, one of the things, in fact, this is primarily where the free software licenses are really focused in on, is to determine what stays open and what stays free. If you are releasing something under an open source or free software license, and I'll talk a little bit about those differences in a couple of slides, the license will determine what of your usage, what of the code that you're including with that software project or folding into that software project or basing on that software project, what of that needs to be open? What of that needs to be free? And a lot of the considerations on what is the right license type for something you want to release is dependent upon that. How open, how free do you want to not only the software you release to be after you release it, but anything that uses or consumes or changes that. It's one of the main goals of the various open source licenses that we'll be talking about. Another reason or way of using or determining what license is makes the most sense for you is how much control do you still want to maintain over this software artifact? When you're creating an open source project, the choice of open source license allows you to adjust the governance model that you want to put in place. And there are some open source licenses which are better suited towards the various open source governance models that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So again, maintaining control or creating a governance model that implements some sort of level of control is another aspect associated with license types and choosing the right license. Another incredibly important reason for creating open source licenses and open source projects is the idea of open standards and having a reference implementation of an open standards or an open protocol such that you avoid the forkage or the divergence of that open standard. If you can have a permissively licensed version of a reference standard, then you're removing the incentive for other people to create divergent versions of that, which might have their own particularities regarding how that standard or that protocol is put in place. And we're seeing a big tie-in between the concept of open standards as far as it refers to open source. For example, Web3 and the whole blockchain associated with it is really fully embracing the idea of open source because they realize that to maintain the health of that new culture, to maintain the health of that new standard, there needs to be viable and easily available open source implementations of those standards out there. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about the concept of free software. And to be honest, the idea of free software kind of was around before the nomenclature of open source. Now, if you look back long ago, back when the computers were the software dongles of the day, where computers were incredibly expensive, software was not really considered an asset. It was not something that you needed to worry about selling or something of that nature. If you were rich enough to afford the computer, then the software was almost, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, were almost just inconsequential. So there really was a sharing hacker kind of, hey, do what you want with the software out there. Now, what happened is that as computers got smaller and more affordable, software became a way to create money, to create revenue. And of course, you could only really do that if you closed access to that source code down. So people could not see what the source code were doing. They could, run the program, but as far as modifying the program, it really wasn't, available to you. And that was the real impetus of the idea of free software. That software itself should be free as in speech, not free as in free beer. And so there are basically four main freedoms associated with software that if the license abides by or gives these four freedoms, it's considered a free software compatible license out there. And it's important to remember that in many cases, this freedom is almost seen as a moral imperative for the free software movement. Now, there is also the other side of the coin is the open source movement. And there really is a lot more in common between the two than separate. Although there are some people that in the free software community, if you mention the word open source, they will get very, very upset. Won't talk anymore about that, but that is the case. So be aware of that potential minefield. But really, in general cases, we're talking about software that really allows for share and reuse and stuff like that. Now, for something to be considered an open source license, it's got to abide by the open source definition. And whether or not it abides by that is the determination of OSI, the Open Source Initiative. And they are the stewards of the open source definition, and they're the ones who determine whether or not a software license is open source or not. If there's one piece of advice, well, I have lots of pieces of advice actually, but one piece of advice to remember is that if it's not an OSI approved license, it isn't by definition an open source license. So let's keep that in the back of our minds, because we'll discuss that a little bit later on. So the Free Software Foundation has four freedoms. OSI has 10 criteria of the open source definition. I basically try to consider open source licenses and the free software license creating three promises between the creator of the open source project and the end user of the open source project or the code base itself. And to make this analogy, or to make this a little bit more clear, let's use the analogy of code equals cookies. And in this particular case, an Oreo cookie, a Hasbro, or is it Nabisco? I can't remember, but an Oreo cookie. I think you're all familiar with it, with the chocolate cookie part on the top and the bottom, and that creamy filling in the middle. So one of the first things about this analogy is that open source allows you to use the software however you want to use it. Now, how does this relate to the code equals cookie idea? Well, you can eat a cookie, right? I mean, that's the normal traditional use of a cookie, but we're also familiar with people who build gingerbread houses and things like that, or maybe just something else you want to do with that particular cookie. The people who are making the Oreo cookie can't determine or restrict how you use that. It's really, really up to you. And that's another promise that the open source licenses provide, is that, yeah, you can use it in the normal way that we expect you to use it. But if you want to fold it or modify it or do something like that, we cannot restrict that from happening. We can't restrict who uses it or how you use it. That's one of the main promises of all open source licenses out there. The other promise is the ability to modify that cookie if it isn't, or that code base. If it isn't directly suitable for you, if it doesn't really quite do what you want it to do, you are perfectly within your right to change it in some specific way, and to make it more suitable for how you want or need that. And we'll talk a little about that a little bit later on. And finally, the third main promise of any open source license out there is the ability to share it, to share not only the original code that you were given, but also your modifications, your improvements on that. Now, there are some considerations regarding what you need to do once you do share it, but you aren't stopped from sharing it. You are able to share things, pretty much with no restrictions, as long as you abide by some conditions and limitations associated with that. So before I actually jump in to the three main license types that we're going to be talking about, I do want to remind people, because I know some people joined a little bit late, I am accepting questions. So if anything I say, makes a question pop up in your mind, don't wait until the end. I mean, you can, of course, I will try to set up time at the end to answer Q&A, but I'm also very, very, ready and willing to answer any questions as they pop up. So be sure to use the Q&A tab in Zoom, and I'll answer them as we go on. I think in a lot of ways, a lot of open source kind of like follows in patterns of three. We talked about the three promises, for example, that open source licenses provide. And I really think that if you look at the various numbers of open source licenses which are out there, and there are a ton of them. I mean, 60 or so, maybe. There's a lot. It can be very confusing, very, very daunting to kind of understand and grok what these licenses do and what these licenses mean. But I really think that if you look at them, you can kind of like distill this group of open source licenses into a family of three main types or three main variations associated with what they allow and what they restrict, or what they require you to do, to contribute back or do to allow to use these codes out there. And again, to make this a little bit more clear, I will continue with this code and cookie analogy. And remember, when I'm talking about this analogy, I'm talking, as far as the code is concerned and the cookie is concerned, I'm not only just talking about the actual physical cookie itself, but the recipe associated with how to make that cookie. Because when you look at open source and software, you're talking about the source code, the instructions of the program, but also the program itself up and running. And so let's keep that in mind, that when we start talking about that, there is associated with an open source this idea that there is the actual instructions of a program or an application and the actual application itself. And open source wants to wrap both of those into an ideal and provide guidance on how to use the open source projects that you're interested in. Now, the first type of open source license out there is historically known as permissive licenses. And these are sort of like the MIT license, the BSD license, the Apache license, the ALv2 license, Apache license version 2. These are called permissive licenses because basically they allow you to do almost anything at all you want to do with the source code when you get it. The only thing that you need to do is you need to give them credit. You need to give the original people who created and wrote the software credit and acknowledgement that they're the ones who have it, and provide a link or URL or something like that to the original thing. Other than that, there are really very, very little to almost no restrictions on how you can use that. And I'll go into a little bit more detail once we start thinking about some of the other ones. Now, the second type of open source license that we'll be talking about is the so-called weak copyleft license. Now, copyleft is a term that was coined by the Free Software Foundation as a counterpoint to copyright. Instead of copyright, it's copyleft. I'm not saying that people have, a great sense of humor, but you can kind of like see where the name came from. But there is a type of family of open source licenses and free software license called the weak copyleft licenses. Some well-known variations of this include the Eclipse license, the LGPL or the lesser GPL license. Some people sometimes call it the library GPL license, but that's really not the case, even though that is most probably the main use of LGPL licenses out there. The Mozilla public license is another good variation of this. And this says that, yes, you can do anything at all you want to do with the license out there with the source code as you pull it in. But if you improve the source code that I gave you, if you improve the code base that you are using or dependent upon, and you release your software out there you need to provide those fixes and those improvements back upstream to the overall community out there. So your changes have to be available for other people to use, and those changes also have to be covered under the same license. So if what you get is an LGPL source code library, and you modify it a little bit, and then you use it as part of your larger work, your larger application, then the changes that you made have to be available to other people to download and play around with under the LGPL license as well, because the source code itself that you used was under LGPL, but your changes need to be under there as well. What's interesting to know is the license of that larger work can be anything you want. It can be LGPL if you want, it can be closed source, whatever. It really doesn't matter as long as that internal code base that you're using that you were obtained upstream, those fixes are brought back up there. And again, I'll describe this a little bit more clear as soon as we get into the idea of strong copyleft. And this basically means that once this software project kind of like is part of your larger distributed work, then that larger distributed work has to be covered under a strong copyleft license as well. GPL-v2, GPL-v3, the AGPL, these are most probably the more famous and well-known strong copyleft licenses out there. Now, some people call these license types, in addition to strong copyleft, viral. And I'm really in a quandary about using that term and propagating that term, because first of all, I don't like the negative connotations associated with that. Strong copyleft licenses are incredibly valued, useful licenses to have, depending on how you want the source code released and what governance model you want to associate with it and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with strong copyleft licenses. And so by calling them viral, you kind of like turn off some people, because especially nowadays, nobody wants to quote, a viral license. But on the other hand, it really gets the point across. It really gets the point across that once this software code base joins with another software code base, the GPL license kind of like, and again, I hate to use this word, kind of like invades that larger overall work, such that that now has to become an GPL, not an LGPL, but a GPL license as well. That viralness, that stickiness transcends and moves over to the larger work. So as a better way of actually coordinating or understanding what this idea is, let's again use this Oreo cookie analogy and just say, for example, that, and again, I think it's Nabisco who makes Oreo cookies, but they found an open source recipe code base that creates the cookie part, the chocolate cookie part, and it's under a permissive license, but they need to modify that because when they put the embossing on it, they want to make that nice little decoration on the cookie, it crumbles because the original recipe they came up with was just, too brittle. And so they needed to make some modifications to it. Now that cookie is part of the larger Oreo cookie itself. They have the Oreo cookie itself. They have that creamy white filling, which is proprietary to them. It's sort of like their secret sauce. It's the thing that makes an Oreo cookie an Oreo cookie. So when they go and release the Oreo cookie itself, they don't even need to provide the improvements they made to the original cookie part of it. And certainly they don't need to provide the recipe to the filling itself, because that cookie recipe was under a permissive license that really does not require them to release any of their improvements back, nor release any of the information or the source code or recipe associated with that larger work outside there. All they need to do is on the back of the Nabisco box saying something like the original cookie recipe was available from this URL. But as far as whatever changes they made to it, they don't need to let anybody know about that. Now, of course, people would want that to happen. People prefer that if you're using permissive licenses and you're improving something, that you give those fixes back at the very least, but it's not required. Now, if that cookie recipe was instead under a weak copyleft license, then the situation would be somewhat different. Nabisco would be required to open source, the changes they made to just the cookie part to the external community out there. So whatever changes they made, whether they added, more eggs or reduced the amount of flour or baked it at a different temperature or something like that, those changes they could no longer keep. They could no longer keep them proprietary to themselves, because the cookie recipe itself was under a weak copyleft, and they made improvements and modifications, and their larger work depended on those changes and modifications. Once they started selling and distribute those cookies, they needed to make sure that those fixes, those modifications, were also available under an LGPL, a weak copyleft license as well. But, and this is the main takeaway, that filling, that creamy filling in the middle is still proprietary. They do not need to release the source code, their recipe for that, just for the changes they made. Now, let's think about what would happen in the case where if the cookie recipe itself was under a strong copyleft license. Well, here, the situation is different, because not only would they need to give up the recipe, the source code for their changes, but they would also be required to release the source code and the recipe for their creamy filling as well. The entire Oreo cookie itself would need to be under a strong copyleft license, the same as that original cookie. And so by looking at it that way, you kind of like see the idea of, first of all, what those conditions are and requirements are between the various license types, but also the reason why the sticky or the quote viral nature of strong copyleft license inside there is because it really controls and restricts the license type of the overall larger distributed work that depends on that open source software program that you're releasing to the external community out there. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, there are some license types which are better suited for various governance models associated with open source communities and ecosystems out there. It should become, or should be at least, kind of obvious that for the walled garden kind of governance model, where a company does release something as open source, but they want to really control and restrict the direction of the project. They want to control and restrict what patches and improvements are made to the project. They also want to control how their competitors use or don't use those that open source project. Walled garden projects are really most tightly associated with strong copyleft licenses as well. Most of all because what they want to ensure is that any improvements that are made to what I provide to you, you need to also make sure everybody. So it doesn't give anyone a quote undue or unfair advantage. So you'll see this in a lot of cases where there are open source projects which are, some would say, open source in name only because it's an open source project under an open source license. It really uses a very, very closed, proprietary walled garden kind of environment. And basically, for those kinds of governance models, strong copyleft licenses are really the best, well suited for that. There is another type of open source governance model called the BDFL, the Benevolent Dictator for Life. And the difference between this and the walled garden is that sort of like in the walled garden environment, the people who are controlling and managing the project have assumed that power for themselves. You know, we are the owners, we are the controllers of this open source project. For the BDFL, it's kind of different. The community, the open source community itself, kind of like assigns ultimate power to a person or a small group of people to basically say, we trust you to know best. We trust you to have ultimate power. So in the walled garden, it's kind of like assumed, whereas in the BDFL, it's kind of like given up. And I love this quote from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, because Dennis is 100% right here. You know, supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical or aquatic ceremony. But the idea is that the power comes from the people, from the community, and there is sort of like a hierarchy inside here. Now, this is really well suited for all kinds of open source licenses out there. There really isn't one which is best suited for another one. And finally, there's the idea of true meritocracy, a very, very flat organization. And most successful meritocratic open source projects, and I realize there's most probably a better word, especially nowadays, the meritocracy, are more better suited towards permissive licenses out there. So for the little bit of time that I have left, I want to go through some ideas and thoughts associated with open source and open source licenses. So I call this little section potpourri. Sometimes you'll see in a lot of cases the idea of dual licensing. And in most cases, what you'll see is something released as open source under what's considered a very, excuse me, you'll see something released under what's considered a scary open source license like the AGPL. And then say, oh, but you know, if you are concerned about using something as open source, or you're concerned about the nature of AGPL, we will sell you a commercial license associated with it. So most cases you'll see dual licensing either in those kinds of business cases where they want to release something as open source, but they really hope that it scares you enough that you actually pay them for use of the software. And sometimes you'll just see it basically for like MIT and ALB2, you know, especially like in the node community, is that you'll see license of the same type, but provides you a little bit more flexibility and freedom. In general, though, anytime you do license something, assume that they will use the most permissive license of whatever dual or triple license scheme you use inside there. But sometimes in some organizations, it makes sense to release something you know, under dual license. There is not a one-size-fits-all license out there. As I said before, there are very good reasons for the different license types out there, depending on what governance model you want, depending on how you want to use and maintain the software, depending on what kind of community you want to build around the software. So the idea that GPL is always right or ALB2 is always right or something like that, that's simply not the case. So when you're deciding what license to use, do more than just go through the pull down menu on license and say, oh, that looks good, or oh yeah, I know what the MIT license is. I'll pick that one inside there, because you're really setting up the entire future of an open source project dependent upon that license choice. Because changing from one type of open source license to another can be incredibly difficult, especially going from a strong copyleft license back down to a permissive license. That can be extremely difficult to do. So before you decide what open source license makes the most sense, spend some time figuring out, first of all, you know, if you're consuming any open source, but also make sure that you're using open source in the right way, because changing can be very difficult. Secondly, you know, is it really open source? You know, there are a handful, but growing number of open source licenses out there that claim to be open source, but when you look at them, they're not open source. They haven't been approved by OSI, and they don't abide by all the 10 conditions of the open source definition. And so really make sure that you're using a license which is open source. And if it's not, make sure that you understand all the conditions and restrictions associated with that. And just speaking for myself, of course, if you value open source, if you value the open source movement, I would say resist and be vocal about those companies that are trying to pull your leg. And trying to promote something as open source when they're not using an open source license out there. We need to maintain open source as a known, viable, but also trusted idea. The reason why people choose open source projects out there is because it's trusted. They know what the conditions are. They know what the requirements are. By using these non-approved licenses, you're kind of like in a legal never land. You're not exactly sure. Another thing to worry about and remember is that open source is not a business model. Open source is basically a way of creating and collaborating with software developers and releasing software out there. But it's not a business model per se. And I think most of the companies nowadays who have gotten into trouble, especially associated with those who have changed licenses back and forth, have done so because they kind of like conflated the two. Now, open source can help define and drive your business model, but in and of itself, it is not a business model. And second, and finally, the biggest thing to worry about, the biggest quote risk associated with open source and using open source is compliance, is making sure that you understand what those software licenses require of you, expect from you. And so make sure that you are educated, but also make sure that your engineering teams are educated as well, knowing what software projects and what licenses are acceptable for consumption. If you're contributing something, what the conditions and limitations and restrictions are associated with that. And if you release something, take time to make sure that what you're releasing is compliant with everything else as well. And this is really some of the biggest aspects, I think, that hold some people back as far as using open source, is that they're worried about this aspect. And here, your legal teams can be great advocates for this because they understand it. Open source is certainly not this unknown, weird, scary thing that it was years ago. But compliance is something you need to worry about. So I do see a question coming up. I won't answer that. I do ask you to, if you enjoyed this, or even if you didn't, I ask you to follow me on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle right there. You can always email me, jimjag@gmail.com. Again, I want to thank Salesforce for allowing me to present here inside here. And I thank everyone for attending. As I said before, there was a lot of stiff competition for sessions, and I really enjoy and appreciate everyone attending. Andre has a question. Let's take a product being sold that is a custom Linux distribution installed on a system with a bunch of untouched, unmodified open source packages and some proprietary application that is also built using some untouched, unmodified open source modules or libraries. What are the obligations? Well, as we've seen, it really varies on, even if something is untouched or unmodified, the choice of license can make a difference inside of there, because what you're worried about is how much does this open source project that you're using, how much does that larger overall work depend upon that? And the answer is, and as that happens, and as you're releasing it, just because something is unmodified or untouched doesn't necessarily mean that the license does or does not apply. License factor in when you release something. That's when it happens in. That's when the licenses kick into effect. And even the AGPL, it even happens when you're just using the application to provide a service. So you don't even need to be actually releasing the software. You just need to be releasing the usage of the software to have the license kick in. So it's really difficult to have a concise answer associated with that. I would definitely look to see what the licenses are of those open source projects and the open source license of what it is you want to distribute. I believe that is it. We are all out of time. If you do have any other questions, please feel free to DM me by Twitter or send me an email. Thank you again, everyone. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the thing. And I did promise to wear my All Things Open 2015 shirt. So cheers all.